before SPD has the authority to utilize blast balls in a riot situation, the mayor has to give approval of that specifically.
Okay.
And the mayor has to declare a state of emergency, has to then specifically authorize blast ball use, and then make a new authorization each day.
Well, that's Seattle City Council member Kathy Moore discussing less lethal weapons with me on Seattle Channel this week, just ahead of a committee meeting with a few twists to it when it comes to how Seattle police will handle crowd control in the future. Plus, the city is bracing for what leaders are calling a new federal context. There's a good phrase for you with the incoming Trump administration. And yes, of course, we're going to talk about the 20 people who applied to fill the vacant District 2 council seat. All that and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine. And my co-host, once again, David Croman, is with me. David, good to be with you as always. And I went down this crazy history wormhole recently and found out this. This week in Seattle, 145 years ago, so back in 1880, Seattle had 6 feet of snow fall over a period of 5 days. I'm not trying to jinx it into reality, but I just feel like those snows of yesteryear, are we ever going to see those again? I wanted to throw that at you. What do you think?
Yeah, well, what was it? It was a couple years ago when it got down to like 15 degrees, and it was
that
pretty
funky
snowy.
February where we had some snow, right?
Yeah, that was kind of intense. But yeah, I don't know. I hope that we don't see 6 feet of snow again. That
is the proper answer. I thank you, sir, as always, for joining me here. Great to be with you, David. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. Go say hi to my buddy John on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks always to the show patrons. So glad to have David H. join us as a patron this week. David, that was a very Seattle nice move on your part. Thank you. Some merch heading your way. If you like the program and if you'd like to get access to Patrons First content and other benefits, please support the show for just $5 a month. You can find the show on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. And when you sign up, you'll get a cool decal, too. How about that? A big thanks to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's do it. Time for Right Here, Right Now. David, I wanted to start with the council's work on less lethal weapons. These are tools that police use in crowd control. The council really hasn't had a policy in place for the last several years, as we've reported on this podcast, some different legal issues and other delays. And remember, folks, this is the issue. If Seattle can get this figured out, this is going to effectively end the consent decree that the SPD has been under since 2012. And David, what struck me about the committee meeting this week was the attention to detail on, okay, which amendment should get passed first? We need to ask the city clerk about this. How's this amendment going to affect the other amendment? Just making sure this measure passed all legal muster. Just looking at the process of it all, what was your takeaway from a 4-hour meeting of the Public Safety Committee on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it showed kind of the difficult balance of trying to legislate something that is inherently kind of chaotic and reactive. I think that a lot of folks look at 2020 and, particularly the use of tear gas in Capitol Hill but, there was a lot of blast balls being used. And so sort of looking at that and saying, well, we don't really want to repeat that, but how do we legislate this so that it doesn't, it's something that we can control but not micromanage, I think is the challenge here. And so really the big debate kind of revolves around those blast balls, because there seems to be pretty broad agreement that tear gas should be fairly heavily regulated. That needs to get approval from the mayor, or at least there needs to be a declaration of civil emergency. The question was whether these blast balls get elevated to that same status. The mayor's office is pushing back pretty hard on that, saying we don't want to tie the officers or the commanding officers' hands on this and slow things down in the process, but I think there was more sympathy on the council for the stories of people who have been injured or by these blast balls. There wasn't a ton of disagreement, but the points of disagreement are sort of in the weeds and wonky enough that they prove to be fairly difficult.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out what happens when this comes to a full council vote. It looks like that's going to happen on February 4th, it looked like Council members Kettle and Saka were in favor of the mayor's proposal. Council President Nelson kind of more in favor of this, giving police more leeway in determining when these blast balls could be used. Council member was a no in that regard, wants the mayor to announce a state of emergency for blast balls to be used. Councilmember Hollingsworth, I noted, abstained with the bigger vote on this. Councilmember Rink, who's not part of this public safety committee, voiced her dissent as well, even though she wasn't allowed to vote. Do you have an idea of what's going to happen in the full council with this measure?
No, I don't. But it does kind of, I think there's a lot of talk about the city council as, there was this wave election and they kind of, all these moderates joined, and the sort of implication is that they would be sort of in lockstep with one another. I think that has always, over the last year, we've seen that it's often a little more complicated than that. And this is a pretty good example. Councilmember Moore, for my money, Councilmember Moore is in some ways, I don't mean this as an insult or anything, but in some ways the least predictable of the members. She's really dug her feet in. She really cares a lot about blast balls and has clearly taken a fairly big sympathy to people who say that they were injured or had sort of traumatic experiences around these. And so from everything I've seen, she's pretty dug in on that issue. And, she's shown to work pretty well with Councilmember Hollingsworth. And I think we know where Councilmember Rinks comes in. As an aside, I will say this is where a council member like Councilmember Tammy Morales might have made a fairly big difference in how this vote ends up. I know she said on the way out that she felt sidelined, but at the end of the day, this is a math equation here, and Councilmember Morales' vote would have been fairly significant on this. I don't know how it turns out, but the fact that it's not clear how this final vote goes, I think for my money shows that Councilmember Morales did have some leverage here, especially with the addition of Councilmember Rink to this council.
That's a really good observation. And one last point here. I look at all these different laws that the council is talking about putting in place when it comes to crowd control. You don't really know how they might affect anything until they're put to the test, meaning, when there's a big rally or a riot or something along those lines. I don't want a riot to happen in Seattle, but these things do happen. And I have some concerns at the back of my mind about what happens on January 20th and the days after that, after President Trump is inaugurated. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. This is not any sort of legislation that's going to be able to go into place before that time. I think it's important to point that out. But I just feel like there's a lot here, and it hasn't been really put to the test yet, I guess.
No, and Chief Operating Officer Brian Maxey said during this meeting that the SPD hasn't actually used a blast ball since October 2020, I think. And so, which is probably a good thing. But it's not like there's a lot of room for making tweaks here and there, because when it's happening, and then sometimes it doesn't happen again for a long time. So I think, again, that's what makes this legislation difficult, is it's not like this is being put to the test every day, which is probably a good thing. But possible they pass this and then they don't find out for several years whether or not it actually works.
So interesting to look at this. But again, this is something that the federal judges said, hey, figure out crowd control. That's the way to get the SPD out from underneath this federal consent decree. So definitely something we're going to be tracking over the next couple of weeks. Again, look for this in the full council on the 4th of February. And I did want to bring up the inauguration, too, with you, David, because this week the council is also discussing, quote, a new federal context that Seattle will be working under. This was a very interesting briefing, I thought, David. Much of it seemed to focus on President-elect Trump, his stance on immigration, Seattle trying to protect its immigrants. There are about 144,000 foreign-born people in the city. And what I really thought was one of the most chilling parts of this was it almost doesn't matter what Trump actually does when it comes to deportations, etc. The Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs is reporting communities are just scared out there. There are so many different possibilities. Mass raids, maybe changes to public charge rules. This is the test that immigration officials use to see how heavily someone might be relying on government assistance in the future. And David, I'm really hoping the city can help people who might be concerned about this. But it really seems like the more these threats or perceived threats come, the more people who are immigrants might stay away from government services, stay away from reporting a crime, stay away from school, stay away from even basic health care. Some thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I mean, I think from my memory, I think we saw that in the first Trump administration, that a lot of people were sort of retreating from society in some ways. There are certain layers to this. Like, there was a big controversy in the first Trump administration when ICE officers would camp out in front of courts and snag people. And, if you're a cop or something like that, not exactly people who think of, think of them as like bleeding heart liberals necessarily, but if you're a cop and you are trying to solve a case or something, and some of the people you want to talk to might be undocumented immigrants.
Yeah.
You're going to have a harder time getting them to show up to court and testify if there
Yep.
are reports of people, ICE officers snagging people there. And so,
Yeah.
you're right. In some ways, there's the reality of what Trump may or may not do around immigration, and we don't entirely know how much is behind his rhetoric always. So we don't know exactly what he's going to do there. But you're right that in some ways the reality of it is parallel to kind of what it does to people's basic involvement in day-to-day society.
Yeah, very true. And I thought the presentation this week was very interesting, too, because they looked back in 2016. President Trump then passed 7 executive orders in his first 10 days. But last week, he actually previewed 100 such executive orders with Republican leadership. So again, not quite sure what's happening, but the city says it is prepared. There was another segment to this, David, that I thought was interesting. I was trying to get a feel if or when federal funding might be in danger for Seattle. The main thing I heard in this meeting was that maybe some of the competitive grants that the city goes for up against other cities may get a little more competitive. But my bottom line from this, I think, was that while they're trying to get prepared, the city doesn't really know how a new president is going to affect them yet when it comes to funding, et cetera.
No, yeah. And I think in real terms, the money that they would probably be most concerned about is federal money, is transportation money. Because, a lot of these projects, the streetcar that never got built.
Right. That was dependent potentially on federal funds, right?
Yeah. And so that's a pretty common refrain. And so, that I think is the area where funding for projects could make the most significant difference. There's also the police department gets a decent number of federal grants. These are much smaller and they tend to be around, maybe some federal partnerships or oftentimes they're like training or, mentorship programs or things like that. But, that would have less of an effect. And you don't see the Trump administration necessarily wanting to be out there cutting grants to police departments.
Sure, right.
And then, I think homelessness and kind of what policies a Trump administration may or may not support. We know that they're skeptical of housing first as a policy, which Seattle has
talked a lot about tent cities and things, expanding those, right?
So, I think that could be another big piece of it because those two things. Because I think, transportation, housing, homelessness, those tend to be issues that are really tied up in federal policy and can make a real difference between administrations.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, David. All right, up next, from the federal level to the state legislature getting started this week, what is ahead in Olympia and how will that affect the city of Seattle? Some notes on that coming up on Now Hear This. Well, Washington State's 69th state legislature is back up and running this week in Olympia as lawmakers embark on a so-called long session of 105 days. This is where legislators put together a 2-year budget, and they will do so up against some concerning news from the State Office of Financial Management. There is a $10 to $12 billion budget gap coming over the next 4 years. Put that in context of a $70 billion budget over 2 years, but there is some work to do here. I talked with Representative Joe Fitzgibbon, the Democrat from the 34th District, also the House Majority Leader, about his approach to the problem recently here on the Seattle Channel.
I think that we'll be looking at an approach that is balanced, that looks at, are there places that we can be more efficient with state government? Are there cuts that we can make that aren't really, going to critically impact the lives of Washingtonians, as well as looking at revenue options, particularly revenue options that ask the wealthiest people in our society who currently pay very little in taxes to pay a little bit more of their fair share.
David, I wanted to bring this up with you because it sounds like while there are a number of Democratic lawmakers saying, heck yeah, let's get a wealth tax going to bring in some new revenue, we heard from then Governor-elect Ferguson at the end of last week, hey, that wealth tax might not be the greatest idea, not my top priority. I just wanted to ask you, how do you see this debate over budget spending playing out between a larger majority of Democrats in the House and Senate and maybe a more moderate Democrat in Bob Ferguson? Yeah,
it's interesting. I think for his part, well, I mean, it is not an immediate tack to the left. I think Ferguson kind of ran as a moderate, and it was part of that was clearly because he was up against a strong challenger and somebody who was seen as a moderate, but from the right. Yeah. And so, he was sort of trying to outflank him on that. Mm-hmm. So the fact that he's coming out and saying this as the governor-elect is interesting because it's showing he's not immediately abandoning those stances that he took on the campaign trail.
Right.
I think more immediately, there's just the practicality of something like a wealth tax, which really there's no parallel for it in the United States. The closest thing would be a property tax, where you have to appraise the value of your home and then you were taxed based on that. But doing that is relatively easy compared to taxing the assets of appraising the assets of someone
Right.
who has over 100 mil, who's earning, has over $100 million. How do you find where all that stuff
Yeah,
is?
right.
How do you create a budget based on that? So while it would certainly bring in money, I think Ferguson probably just doesn't see it as something that is going to help him in any sort of anything close to the near term, even if it were to pass. And I don't think it would pass. I mean, you see Nick Hanauer, who's sort of the
Right.
voice of progressive taxation in Washington State, saying it's a stupid idea.
Yeah.
And I think he would not be alone in that. So the Democrats have pretty good majorities in the state legislature. They're not super majorities though, and
No.
some of them are pretty moderate. And I think more than that, I think some of them would probably just be skeptical about whether or not it's actually a solution. And so I think it's an interesting turn away from Governor Inslee. It's hard to not see his proposal a little bit as a, hey, I'm headed out of town and
Yeah,
we need to
right.
balance budget. So here, wealth tax, that does it.
Yep. And I'm out. Right. Yeah. And it's interesting. I talked with Senator Jamie Peterson from the 43rd District about this, the Democrat there. And he was saying also with a wealth tax, I mean, this has been brought up before in the legislature. It was definitely considered last year, although at a much higher threshold, $1 billion to start off with there. I think one of the big concerns was, how do you actually get this to stick? Meaning, all right, if we look at someone who's going to be here 182 days a year, like half the year, and Senator Peterson's point was like, well, you know what? These people who have that much money, they probably have a few other places to live around the country, around the world, where they could
Right.
hole up for a bit, not even pay this. So,
Right.
yeah, there's definitely some work ahead there when it
Switch
comes to
residencies to one of their other homes. And
absolutely.
they don't have to
Yeah,
change,
it could be
they don't
done.
have to change anything about their lifestyle. They just
Right.
file some new paperwork. That's
Right.
what Jeff Bezos did.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I'm interested to see what happens with that discussion there, but I think it is going to get a hearing at the very least. So a good discussion ahead in Olympia. And I do always try to figure out those links between what the state is doing and how that impacts Seattle. One issue could be a proposal floating around in the Capitol to delay some added investments in childcare and early learning. That's something to keep an eye on. Also, this plan to allow more lot splitting so landowners can build more homes on their properties. That's interesting to me. And then there's this idea that's come and gone for many years, some kind of cap on the rent increases landlords are allowed to put in place. David, I know you keep focused on City Hall, but are there any state issues you have half an eyeball on this session? What do you got?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the question of, I do think the state has seized the issue of housing. Used to be a local issue. And I think there's, increasingly bipartisan recognition at the state that cities are not doing what they need to do to provide the basic housing supply. And so, I think the lot splitting bill is interesting. And, we heard Councilmember Moore sort of gripe a little bit about the legislating from the state. And I would expect that there's more about, because, that's exactly why the state is doing it, because people like Councilmember Moore are griping about it. And so I would expect more progress there. And like I said, I think Republicans are eager to do it too, because it's an area where they can actually, have some involvement and real kind of shape the issue on something like rent caps or rent capping on landlord fees. That's going to be a Democrat, probably a progressive left Democrat issue. Not a lot of Republican buy-in on that. So it'll be interesting to see, if with expanded majorities in the state, how the Democrats kind of prioritize what they do. Is it going to be on something where they feel like they have some common ground with Republicans, or are they going to forge ahead on the issues that they can only pass with their own members' votes?
Yeah, where do they use that political capital? It's so interesting to hear that lot splitting bill just brings together so many different constituencies, including big businesses and builders who are like, yeah, we want to build more. We're right with you. Let's do this thing. So it's interesting to see those changes there as well. All right, we do need to switch gears again and talk about the Seattle City Council vacancy in District 2. Here we go. And then there were 20. So we're talking about some names with ties to City Hall, like the Senior Transportation Policy and Operations Manager for the Mayor's Office, Adonis Duxworth. Then there's the former leader of the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, Randy Engstrom, Assistant City Attorney Edward Lynn, plus Seattle Parks and Recreation Sustainability and Environmental Manager and failed 37th Legislative District candidate Chakundi Salisbury. A few other former candidates, too. You got Mark Solomon, who lost to Tammy Morales for the council seat in District 2 back in 2021, was not given the citywide seat last year that Tanya Wu ended up taking. Then Nimco Bulale, who ran unsuccessfully for a House seat in the 37th district in 2022, also worked on passing the most recent Seattle housing levy. You can check out all the candidates at the city clerk's website. I just highlighted a few there, David. Any surprises here? I wanted your take on the candidates. You wrote about this in the Seattle Times.
Yeah, I wouldn't say any surprises necessarily. No super familiar names. It would be funny if they appointed Mark Solomon, because that would mean that twice in a row they've appointed somebody who lost to Councilmember Tammy Morales in an election. So if we really wanted to dig the knife in one more time to Councilmember Morales,
I hope not.
They could appoint Mark Solomon. I don't think that he is considered the favorite here. No real surprises. It's kind of an interesting process because it's not sort of overtly political in the way that a campaign trail is, but you still see a lot of kind of behind the scenes jockeying for support and backing.
People are lobbying for them in public comment and so forth. Yeah,
we saw Councilmember Wu kind of lock up the backing of business last time, and that seemed to have an effect. And Labor will have someone that they get behind. It'll be interesting to see if Labor and business can agree on someone. They didn't last time. And then, it'll be interesting to see too if whoever they choose is a kind of caretaker, somebody who's just here until November when somebody else wins, or if it's somebody with political aspirations. My guess would probably be the latter. It's a big job to just want to do for a little bit, and then leave right when you kind of get your feet under you. But maybe the members of the council don't want someone who's going to be that political in that position, in which case they'll go with someone who just kind of sit there for a little bit.
It's so tough, but at the same time, you want somebody with some juice, some energy, right? Who really is energized to do the job and perhaps wants to continue on in that role. But I noticed among the 20, there was no aged legislator coming back from retirement or something like that. That would be the portrait of someone who was a caretaker. That Kirsten Harris Talley, that sort of candidate was not there. I did want to ask further about
John Okamoto,
exactly.
who was like a long department head, a department guy. He was kind of a longtime bureaucrat. He just knew how things worked. He was sitting there for a year and then they left. That's a good point. That I didn't see anybody like that on the list.
Yeah, interesting to see that. I did want to ask about this just in terms of how the council goes about its selection this time around. They did this last year. They selected Tanya Wu. That didn't really work out for whatever other reason, meaning she didn't stay on the council there. And I talked with Councilmember Moore about this last week, and she said, okay, unlike last time, I'm going to talk with as many of these candidates as possible before this selection process. She didn't do that the last time, and I thought that was interesting. I mean, these were council members. This is basically the first thing they did in 2024. I wanted to get your take on this. How do you see the council approaching this process in 2025 differently than they did in 2024? What do you think?
Councilmember Wu, or former Councilmember Wu, was a good, obvious choice for them because they all knew her. It was like the only person they knew. They had just spent these months on the campaign trail with her. They were also so new themselves that they were kind of perhaps open to be swayed by whether it's Councilmember Nelson or the business community. Not to say that was their final decision, but now I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a little more variety. Maybe we get more nominations than just, because I don't remember how many people actually got nominated, but it wasn't that many last time. So maybe we get more individual nominations, maybe more rounds before voting until someone's finally decided. I think at the end of the day, this group is just going to be a lot more confident than they were a year ago.
Yep, and able to make their own decisions about these things, too. Very good point there, David. All right, coming up, more political candidates getting ready to roll in 2025, including our city attorney in Seattle, Ann Davison. David wrote about her newly launched campaign. We're going to learn about it coming up on What's Next. David, I wanted to touch on your piece in the Seattle Times from a couple of days ago about City Attorney Ann Davison running for office again. She landed in office rather surprisingly, I would say, 4 years ago. Pete Holmes, the incumbent, was bumped out of the primary by Nicole Thomas Kennedy, a police abolitionist, and then Davison won the general election rather handily with 55% of the vote, and now she's set for a re-election bid. I thought it was really interesting how you pointed out in your story that Davison, when she was elected, kind of turned into the start of this wave of more moderate to conservative leaders coming into Seattle City Hall. Is she surrounded with enough support now to be successful in a re-election bid, or what do you see her focusing on?
Yeah, I think she's going to run the same kind of campaign that we're going to see a lot of people on the city council run, which is hey, I've started this work to make Seattle safer. I think
Tough
it's
on
making,
crime. Yep.
yeah, I think it's making a difference, and I need more time to see this vision through to the end.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think there's a certain, I think there's probably a greater incumbency advantage in this job because it's not one that people think about all that often. It's really one, I would say maybe of all of them, I don't know, maybe not mayor, but it's one that people are going to vote with based on how they feel, I would think. If they are walking down the street and they feel safer or less safe, I think that's going to have a big influence on how they vote for city attorney because
Right.
I think she's going to get some strong challengers because unlike maybe Mayor Harrell, I think she's seen as vulnerable. And so, we have one guy, Rory O'Sullivan, who has a, fairly strong resume in landlord or in tenant rights, kind of legal rights for tenants. And
Right.
I imagine we'll see more jump in, maybe some folks who look kind of more in the mold of Pete Holmes. But I guess the question at the end of the day is like, has Ann Davison done anything that will make voters want to get rid of her? I think
Yeah.
is probably the question that applies more to the city attorney than any other position is, do voters want a change of direction? And I don't know, it has only been 4 years. And we'll see. It'll be an interesting test case.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, she's the city attorney's office does not deal with felonies. It's misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors, which I think is an important distinction here. And that's really been her focus, an office that I think had some focus on that in the past under Pete Holmes. She's really galvanized it in a different way. And it sounds like, at least from your piece and reading it, she's brought more cases forward, but there's still been some concern about actually getting them through the courts or whatever else. I feel like that might be the contention point that certainly some of her opponents would bring up with her.
Yeah, which, I mean, really has more to do with the court than anything because there's this law that basically says the court can't add additional judges to help ease the backload. And so, they can bring as many cases as they want, and there's just going to be a certain bottleneck at the court. And I think it probably frustrates them. But, I think because it's not necessarily felonies, I think the city attorney's office is associated most with sort of general disorder.
Yeah, right.
Low-level property crime or graffiti or, to an extent, mental illness and substance use on the streets.
Yeah.
She was really out in front of this soap and soda stuff.
Yep.
And so which I think puts her in some ways as a face of just disorder in Seattle. And so again, which is a risky thing to do, right? Because if people still feel uneasy about walking down 3rd Avenue or 12th and Jackson or whatever it might be, they might associate that with Ann Davison because it's the issue she has adopted. I think the question she's going to want to ask is compare it to 4 years ago and what's your answer here? Again, does it matter that she had run as a Republican before? I think when paired against somebody who was an out-and-out police abolitionist, it was not enough to make her lose the race. But what happens when she has to run against kind of more mainstream Democrat, who's going to hammer on that for sure.
Oh, yeah. Not a partisan office, but that always comes up in these races for sure. Thank you for that, David. I do need to wrap up with you, and I think I'm with you. I've been reading. I always try to track the different things you're putting on social media because it leads to great conversations. But some of the best/worst headlines in Seattle sports these days are, hey, this really great free agent will not be signing with the Mariners. Oh, yeah, Bobby Wagner. Remember him? He really wanted to stay with the Seahawks, but now you should totally root for him because his team is in the playoffs. Have we been reduced to using other teams outside the city to validate Seattle's sports existence? This is the existential question I'm dealing with right now. What do you got for me, man?
Yeah, it feels that way. I know. It's amazing Seattle sports fans' ability to kind of convince themselves that something might happen. When there was never any indication it would, like signing this guy from Japan.
Right.
Feels like a Lucy in the football kind of situation.
Getting pulled away every time. You know what, David? I'm switching back to talking to you about gardening next week. This is getting a little too depressing. But I thank you, as always, for joining me, sir. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show. David H., looking at you, buddy. If you're not a patron, please support the show for just $5 a month. Find the podcast on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.